Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Israel delays the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners after 6 Israeli hostages return home. The UK says it's time to turn the screws on Putin's Russia as it prepares to unveil its biggest set of sanctions against Russia since the start of the war with Ukraine. The Vatican says Pope Francis is in a critical condition in hospital where he's being treated for pneumonia in both lungs. Hello, I'm Rishka Gupta and welcome to the programme, where we start with the fragility of the Gaza ceasefire, which is in the spotlight tonight after Israel's Prime Minister indefinitely postponed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners. After meeting with his top security officials, Benjamin Netanyahu says the inmates won't be freed until the next release of hostages is guaranteed. In a statement announcing the move, Mr. Netanyahu railed against what he called degrading release ceremonies and the use of hostages for propaganda purposes. Talks on the second phase of the agreement have not yet begun. Hamas says the delay violates the ceasefire deal. On Saturday, 6 hostages were freed during handovers in Rafah, Nuseirat and Gaza City. They are the final living captives to be returned in the first phase of the deal. Earlier, I spoke to Laura Blumenfeld. She's a former U.S. State Department senior policy advisor on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team and is now a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Center for Strategic and International Studies. Now, this was supposed to be the last exchange of hostages and Palestinian prisoners as phase 1 of the deal, but now we're seeing that Israel has delayed the release of over 600 Palestinian prisoners. So how do you see impact getting to stage 2 of the deal?
Yes, indeed. Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special Middle East envoy, was meeting tonight with Ron Dermer, Prime Minister Netanyahu's political negotiator. And what Witkoff said is that he was hoping that the, quote, goodwill from this phase 1 would kind of usher the way into phase 2. Obviously, today was anything but goodwill. It was, ill will and humiliation for Israel. One of the hostages who was released, according to his father, was ordered by the Hamas gunman to kiss one of his captors on the head before he was released. And here's the thing about the Middle East, and it's also true of President Trump. You can't have this kind of moment of revealed weakness in order to gain and hold respect. And so I think that Netanyahu, especially on the day when they were supposed to release the largest number of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, including 100 who had been convicted on murder, I think he felt like he just had to do something in some kind of reaction. Otherwise, in this kind of ugliest of arm wrestles as we approach phase 2, he would feel like he was losing the upper hand.
So, Laura, building on that, are the two sides, in fact, ready for stage 2 of the deal? And this is going to get a whole lot more complicated now because it foresees the end to the war and also Israel withdrawing troops from Gaza. So how is that deal looking now? How fragile do you think it is?
Well, ready or not, here it comes. I do believe we'll go forward. I'm not sure in what form, if it'll be as negotiated under President Biden before he left office. But I do think it will happen for several reasons. First and foremost is that what we're talking about now are Israeli soldiers who are being held. And if there's anything, if there's one credo, every Israeli will tell you that they're sort of the secret in their sauce, as one combat pilot told me, was that, no man left behind. So Israel is going to do what it takes to bring those final hostages home. And secondly, again, President Trump, totally different approach than President Biden. America first, and there are Americans still being held, both deceased Americans in terms of their bodies, and then one living American. His name is Eden Alexander. And if there's just one name that you can think of that might sort of inspire and motivate, the United States to stand even stronger with Israel, that's Eden Alexander.
And speaking of the U.S., Laura, there's a big question about pressure on Israel. We saw President Donald Trump putting a lot of pressure on Israel's Netanyahu to enforce phase 1 of the deal. But then just some 24 hours or so ago, he was saying that actually he's fine with whatever Israel decides to do, whether it decides to go to phase 2 or continue with the war. So this is quite confusing now where U.S. sits in all of this. What do you make of that, and how could that impact the lack of this pressure, perhaps, in getting to phase 2?
Yeah, well, U.S. leverage in the region is always a fascinating and in some ways the most important question. And what I worry about is not even so much about the pressure Trump can put on Netanyahu, because it's clear that Netanyahu is very eager to please President Trump, but it's what kind of respect and leverage the president of the United States has in the Arab world. Because first with his Gaza, takeover plan, and then with that high noon deadline that he set to release all the hostages last week, he didn't follow through on either of those threats. Hamas said, your words have no meaning. And what that means is that there's no consequences. Without that, there's no leverage. And the U.S. is going to very quickly lose their ability to impact events on the ground. So I think we just have to wait and see. What does it mean when the U.S. envoy for hostages says that it will be, quote, total annihilation of Hamas if they don't release the hostages? There's got to be some bite in that bark. Otherwise, they're going to be very limited.
And there's a big question about how Arab leaders react to Trump's proposals for Gaza. He says he wants to make it the Riviera of the Middle East, but that would involve displacing over 2 million Palestinians. The Arab leaders, they haven't been supporting this idea, and they met in Saudi Arabia to discuss a counter proposal. Do we have any idea of what that could look like, or what are you expecting to come from those types of talks?
Well, it'll look like what we always thought it would look like. In other words, we're back to square one where we started, which is a Palestinian leadership that isn't associated with Hamas, perhaps a kind of reconstituted Palestinian Authority, financed chiefly by the Gulf, but also by other countries who support, kind of a reintegration of Palestinians back into their home, what many consider their homeland, which is Gaza. But the unfortunate thing is that we've kind of lost a lot of our bargaining power along the way. President Trump has backed off. Look, he's flexible. You could call it a flip-flop. But he is saying, I'm surprised that they weren't willing to listen to me. We give them billions of dollars of aid, but so be it. I'll just sort of sit back and watch. So I think that at least he isn't doubling down. He's sort of focusing his firepower right now on Ukraine and forcing a ceasefire there in a kind of a reverse of what President Biden was very much pressuring Netanyahu to reach a ceasefire and hands off with Zelensky. Here we're seeing quite the opposite.
And the Vatican has said for the first time that Pope Francis is in a critical condition in the hospital, where he's being treated for pneumonia in both lungs. The 88-year-old was given a blood transfusion and oxygen after his condition worsened over the past 24 hours. The Vatican says the Pope remains alert, but his prognosis was still guarded. Our Europe correspondent Sarah Rainsford has the latest.
The Pope himself has asked for openness and transparency about the state of his health. And so we've been getting regular statements from the Vatican on how he is. And I have to say that the latest statement that's come this evening is the starkest one yet. It repeats the fact that Pope Francis is in a critical condition, and he is still, as the statement says, not out of danger. But what they have described in addition is a prolonged respiratory crisis this morning, which required extra oxygen. They've also said that the Pope needed blood transfusions because tests showed that he had anemia. So those are two quite significant developments, I think. They say, though, that the Pope is still alert. They say he is suffering, is in more pain than he was yesterday, but he was sitting in his armchair again today. So stressing, I think, the fact that he is still alert, still very much there, and still very much fighting this double pneumonia, which obviously is extremely serious. It's interesting, though, that this comes after the doctors treating Pope Francis yesterday made their first public statements on his health, and they were quite upbeat. The words were serious, but their tone was jovial almost at some points. They said that the Pope was joking, that he was in good spirits, and they also said for the very first time that in fact he was responding to medication. They said at that point, though, that the situation was a delicate balance and that anything additional could tip that balance. So tonight, stressing that the Pope is in a critical condition, but as I said, still alert, and he still spent the day in his armchair. He is not bedridden.
And the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy says the UK will unveil a sweeping package of sanctions against Russia on Monday, saying that it is time to turn the screws on Vladimir Putin's Russia. In a statement, the Foreign Secretary said this is a critical moment in the history of Ukraine, Britain and all of Europe. Now it's time for Europe to double down on our support for Ukraine. The unveiling of the sanctions will mark the 3-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On Saturday, Prime Minister Keir Starmer reiterated the UK's ironclad support for Ukraine and insisted Kyiv's voice must be at the heart of any peace negotiations ahead of meeting President Trump next week. It's as Ukraine and the US appear to be inching closer to signing a deal that would give the US rights to Ukraine's deposits of rare earth minerals. Donald Trump has styled this as a way for Ukraine to repay the US for its past military support. He was addressing Republicans at the Conservative Political Action Conference on Saturday.
I'm dealing with President Zelensky. I'm dealing with President Putin. I'm trying to get the money back or secured because, Europe has given $100 billion. The United States has given $350 billion. But here's worse. Europe gave it in the form of a loan. They get their money back. We gave it in the form of nothing. So I want them to give us something for all of the money that we put up. And I'm going to try and get the war settled, and I'm going to try and get all that death ended.
Our political correspondent Ben Wright has more.
While Donald Trump has appeared to blame Ukraine for Russia's invasion, Keir Starmer told President Zelensky today that this was Russia's illegal war. And while the recent talks between the United States and Russia excluded Ukraine, Keir Starmer told the Ukrainian president that his country had to be at the heart of the negotiating table. Now, the Prime Minister has also spoken today to the European Commission President and the President of Finland as European countries try and nail down their shared position ahead of a crucial week of diplomacy. The French President Macron will be in Washington on Monday. Keir Starmer will then visit the White House on Thursday. And in a piece he's written for Tomorrow's Sun on Sunday, the Prime Minister sets out some of his thinking, saying that a peace deal which does not stop Putin from attacking again would be a disaster for everyone. He believes America must be part of Ukraine's security guarantee, but says President Trump is right that European countries, including the UK, must spend more on defence. He also says he's struck by the US president's commitment to peace. So that's the argument he's going to be making in Washington. But it could be a precarious tightrope to tread. The jeopardy is very high.
And a new short documentary is investigating the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on its NATO neighbours. The filmmakers behind Putin's Endgame, The Stakes Beyond Ukraine, found growing concern about regional security in countries like Finland and Sweden. And I've been speaking to the team behind the documentary about how countries in the region are bracing for what's to come. You spoke with the locals and officials in some of those neighbouring countries on the border with Russia, like Sweden and Finland. What was the mood like there? And is there the concern that if Ukraine falls to Russia, that those countries could be the next target?
Well, first off, I think we should be pointing out that Sweden and Finland ended up joining NATO as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Those two countries were historically neutral, non-aligned states. Now, switching over to Estonia, one of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they have a long history, and Finland as well. Finland was attacked by the Soviets in the Second World War. They were fortunate enough to push them back. The Baltic states weren't so lucky. And if in Estonia, which butts right up to Russia, where Vladimir Putin has already said that he has designs on retaking Narva, which is the town that we were in right on the border. They joined NATO in good faith. They are looking towards Europe, and they're looking towards the United States. And I'm not so sure that they're feeling as confident today as they did a month or so ago with the reverberations coming out of the White House.
And Kevin, do the people that you've spoken to, do they believe that Russia does actually want a peace deal? And even if they get a peace deal, do they have faith that will last?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because there really is a difference in perception when you cross the Atlantic. And that is, they do not trust Vladimir Putin at all. They say, the foreign minister of Estonia actually said this point blank to us, that the peace deal that they are looking at or that they want has to include the people of Ukraine. They are saying, for example, that Ukraine is fighting this war on their behalf. Ukraine is fighting all of their war. Ukraine is fighting the war for the greater Europe, and it needs to have the support. NATO has to show its support. Article 5 states that should any NATO member be attacked, then the rest of the members join in. Well, one of those members is the United States of America. And all of a sudden, the United States is making noises like, well, we're going to make a peace deal with Putin without Ukraine at the table. Well, no one in that region trusts Vladimir Putin with anything. If he does get a peace deal, they're convinced he's just going to regather his resources, build up his army again, and go after someone else, i.e., as Joel just mentioned, who's next? It could be us.
And picking up on that point, Kevin, Joel, I want to turn to you and just ask you about that relationship with the US. Trump has called Zelensky a dictator and said that he started the war, which is untrue. Do you think the rest of Europe is now going to be wondering that if the US president was going to support them if a situation arose that they would need it?
I think that the mood that we felt, and certainly in my getting back to the people that we talked to a month or two ago, they feel that this U-turn in U.S. policy towards Ukraine has put them in a quandary onto whether they actually have the support of the United States or whether they really have to go it on their own. They know the U.S. wants to have them have more input, but going on their own is a whole different ballgame. They're dependent on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. If the U.S. decides that they are not going to be part of this, there's only 2 nuclear states in Europe, and that's France and the UK. Will they be the nuclear umbrella for the rest of the continent? I think these are real questions that leaders, certainly that have borders with Russia, are scratching their heads and saying, is the U.S. still a partner for us?
So, Kevin, the US, we know, has been pushing for a minerals deal with Ukraine. How are the people of Ukraine feeling right now, being asked to give up more things in order to end this war?
Foreign Minister of Estonia said to us that this could be Donald Trump's Churchillian moment, but they actually believe that Trump could save the day, that this could be his Churchill moment to take us off the path towards World War III or whatever path that we're on right now. And I'm hoping that at some point the Estonians, the Baltic regions, the Ukrainians will be able to get that message across. And that message includes the United States arming Ukraine the way it should be armed in order to fight back for the sake of everyone.
Now, Donald Trump's government efficiency advisor Elon Musk has issued an ultimatum to U.S. federal government employees, saying that they must respond to an email justifying their work or resign. But the newly appointed head of the FBI has telling them to ignore the email, saying that the Bureau will conduct its own staff reviews. The boss of the Federal Workers Trade Union called Mr. Musk's email cruel and disrespectful and vowed to challenge unlawful sackings. German voters decide on Sunday who will run their next government, with Friedrich Merz's conservative Christian Democrats favoured to become the biggest party in power, boosting the European Union's biggest economy, as well as reforms to immigration are the main issues in this snap election, triggered by the collapse of centre-left Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition last fall. And at a time of global uncertainty, Germans and their European allies are looking to this election to provide clear leadership and direction. But forming a coalition government may prove to be challenging for the candidate who comes out on top. Sumi Somaskanda reports on how important the economy is to German voters as they head to the polls.
One of the biggest issues in this election season in Germany has been the economy. Its vaunted industry is struggling. The country's been in a recession for the last 2 years. There were more than 20,000 bankruptcies filed last year alone, the biggest number in about 10 years here in Germany. And indeed, energy costs have shot up. That is in part because of Russia's war in Ukraine and Germany trying to diversify its energy supply from Russian oil and gas and turning to renewable energies, which then led to higher electricity prices for many Germans. We spoke to one small business owner here in Magdeburg who said he saw the German economy as a sinking ship, and he is looking for political leaders to get things back on track. He also said he wanted to see the red tape cut that there is for small businesses and big businesses alike, and that he is waiting for politicians to actually deliver on what they say they will do ahead of an election. So the economy has been weighing on many people's minds, and certainly we can say of the older people we spoke to here, the older voters, they are concerned about inflation because it is eating into their pensions, their limited pensions that they receive every month, and they want to see that addressed by politicians and the new government to bring down prices and tackle inflation.
Joining me now live is Dr. Hope Harrison, Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. So voters are heading to the polls tomorrow. What are the main issues that are going to impact their decision?
The main issues are economics, immigration, and the war in Ukraine. Economics, as you just said, Germany's been in a recession for 2 years, so pocketbook issues. People want prices to be lowered, especially for rent, groceries, and heat. Immigration has been a real problem. Refugees seeking asylum in Germany have recently carried out a series of violent attacks in Germany. Just yesterday at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, someone stabbed a passerby. Recently in Munich, so there have been several such attacks by refugees that has people very concerned. And finally, the war in Ukraine. This moment for Germany is really feeling existential to many Germans about their future. Because on the one side, they've got Russia, who has invaded Ukraine and waged a war for 3 years, and Germans feel vulnerable. There's war on their continent. On the other hand, their transatlantic ally of decades, the United States, suddenly seems to have kind of flipped sides and supports and trusts Putin more than European allies.
Right.
So this is a very important moment, and about 83% of Germans in a recent poll are very concerned about the situation.
I'll just add to your previous comments there about the attacks. They are suspected to have been by asylum seekers. But first, talk to me about the growing popularity of the far-right party, the AfD. All the mainstream German parties have ruled out forming a coalition with the AfD, and that includes Merz's CDU. So can the AfD still be a part of the government in light of that?
The AfD will not be part of the new government, but they will be playing a very disruptive role. And their popularity will make it much harder for a coalition government to form. In Germany, this parliamentary system, they can only rule with coalitions of several parties, ideally 2 or 3. Most recently, it was 3 parties, which that government collapsed in November because the 3 parties couldn't really agree on lots of things, especially economics. And it's pretty clear that it may take months for a new government to form. It's clear that the CDU under Friedrich Merz, the center right, will win. Who they'll rule in coalition with is going to take some time. And in Germany, all the ruling parties have to sign a coalition treaty before the government takes charge. All the policies have to be agreed on and then signed off on. And 4 years ago in the German election, that took several months. Germany and Europe feel like they don't have the time. It's so important right now to have a stable German government, yet many fear it's going to be a while until there's a stable government. And even once that government is formed, will it be able to hold together and make improvements so that the AfD does not gain further electoral popularity?
All right, and we will have to leave it there. But thank you so much to Dr. Hope Harrison at the George Washington University. Now, we just want to show you some beautiful winning entries from the Nature in Focus photography competition. It aims to capture the best moments of the natural world, from spiders to water buffaloes in Sri Lanka. The contest showcases stunning images, as you can see, while highlighting critical conservation issues. Winners are chosen from various categories, including animal behavior and creative nature photography. This year, elephants, tigers and bears also featured in some of those winning images. And you can stay up to date with all of our top stories on the website, bbc.com/news, or on our app. We'll be back with you at the top of the hour. Stay with us here on BBC News.